All right, let's get started. So welcome and bienvenue to the Canadian Internet Governance Forum for 2024, Canada on the World Stage. We're so glad that you've joined us in person and virtually for Canada's premier stakeholder forum on digital policy dialogue, where together we'll work on charting a collective course for Canada's digital future. Before we get going, I wanted to take a moment to help set up everyone for a successful day. So first, a brief but important note on simultaneous translation. So headsets for simultaneous translation can be found on my left side of the room. And for our virtual audience, you can click on the globe icon in the middle of the bottom of your screen for translation between French and English. I also wanted to offer land acknowledgement. So today, we're situated on the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. This land has served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous people. We would like to acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence mark this territory on which we will now gather. We respect the continued connection with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with the Indigenous and other peoples within the Ottawa community. And I'd also just like to offer a brief reflection on our purpose today. So we're gathering at what we can all agree is a pivotal moment with the rapid evolution of technology and its intersection with profound societal challenges, and I think what we would all agree is polycrisis. From the governance of emerging technologies to the ethical dilemmas posed by artificial intelligence, and from strengthening democratic institutions to addressing polarization, the issues we face are interconnected, complex, and urgent. Today's program focuses on how we can leverage Canada's unique strengths in internet governance and global affairs as the internet community, so we can shape our digital future for decades to come. What we know is that a whole-of-society approach, one that integrates the expertise and perspectives of government, academia, industry, civil society, the technical community, and every individual, is essential to navigating these challenges. Our interconnected digital landscape is simply not a collection of technologies. More so, it is technologies in addition to a reflection of our values, our priorities, our responsibilities, and our collective choices. As we innovate, we must ask ourselves big and important questions. How do we ensure that governance frameworks keep pace with technological advancements? How can AI be deployed and developed ethically, equitably, and inclusively? And how do we safeguard the democratic principles that underpin our society while fostering informed, engaged, and resilient communities? And how can the Canadian innovation community solve its productivity challenge by creating and developing greater trust on a broad level, develop and expand more technical expertise, increase compute capacity, and increase uptake across the nation? These are wicked challenges. So this dialogue is not just an opportunity to share knowledge, but it's a call to action for all of us. Together today, we'll explore pathways to ensure that Canada leads responsibly in the digital age, with a focus on accountability and long-term sustainability. As I mentioned, we all have a role to play, and most importantly, an opportunity to roll up our sleeves and contribute. The remarks today, as one way we can contribute, the remarks today will actually inform a policy report that will be circulated across Canada's internet community and on the global stage at the Internet Governance Forum. So as you take in the panels today, also please keep note of your own recommendations, your own big questions, your own critiques, and please do send them in. So just a few housekeeping notes, and then I'll introduce our first keynote. So please engage with the Canadian IGF online using hashtag CIGF2024 and tag us on X and LinkedIn. You can follow along where we are in the agenda at canadianigf.ca/event-details. And there's a QR code there's a QR code where you can access the agenda found on the back of all of your name tags. There are washrooms behind the registration desk. And if you do need to take a private call, and we know that you're all juggling multiple priorities, or need to have a side conversation on something that you've heard today, There are meeting rooms on the 9th floor that are available during networking and lunch breaks. If you do venture to the 9th floor during the program, we just ask that you be conscious that it's an open area and that the noise will trickle down, so we just ask that you keep your discussions to a minimum. Okay, those are the only kind of rules for today. So let's begin. First, I'd like to welcome our keynote of the morning, Byron Holland, who is the president and CEO of CIRA, the Canadian Internet Registration Authority. Byron is an expert in internet governance and a seasoned entrepreneur. He's been at the decision-making table for key moments in the history of internet governance and has held numerous leadership positions at ICANN and is on the board of directors for Torex, Canada's largest internet exchange point, as well as the Council of European National Top-Level Domain Registries. Welcome, Byron.
How's that? Better? Okay. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, Victoria. Slide? All right, thank you. And welcome, everybody. Welcome to this awesome venue. If you do go to the 9th floor, make sure to take the slide back down. I know I'm waiting for that at lunch. It's pretty awesome to be in this old Shopify space. I'm not sure what they were thinking by leaving Ottawa, but it's left us a great space to operate in. Anyway, good morning, everybody, and welcome again to the Canadian Internet Governance Forum 2024, Canada on the World Stage. As this year's presenting sponsor of the CIGF, we are so glad, I'm so glad, that to have you all here today at this, I would say, incredibly important time in internet governance and digital policy. Both here in Ottawa, welcome, and also wherever you're participating from virtually, welcome. I imagine that this year you've heard the term inflection point used quite a bit. And today, I'd actually like to explore the inflection point that we're facing when it comes to internet governance and how we can come out the other side of this with what matters to us, a free, open, interoperable internet for the 21st century, including improved oversight and an updated multi-stakeholder model of internet governance. Today, I'll take you through 3 ways that I think can help us get there. First, regarding governance on the internet, that is the laws and regulations on the application and content layers, the technology layers that we as humans interact with every day. We need wise and pragmatic legislation to help curb the harms experienced by end users and democracies themselves around the world. Second, as we wind through heightened debates of governance of the internet, the governance of the actual networks that connect us all, we need to ensure that the diverse group of stakeholders that both use and operate the internet also get to participate in the process. One of the biggest internet governance debates set to take place is the upcoming World Summit on the Information Society Plus 20, or WSIS Plus 20 review. You may ask, what's the Plus 20? 20 years ago, the original WSIS happened, and now 20 years later, it's the review, WSIS Plus 20. And that's where all governments will get together to renegotiate the agreements that set out the terms of internet governance. And we'll talk a bit more about that shortly. Third, to achieve a better, free, and open internet, we need to strengthen the multi-stakeholder model of internet governance. And that includes governments, private sector, civil society, academia, and certainly those of us in the technical sector who operate the internet. I think it's safe to say at this point, the Wild West era of the internet is behind us, and quite frankly, probably for the better. But as democratic governments grapple with the internet's negative externalities in their own jurisdictions, they must equally step up to bat in processes critical to internet governance, like the WSIS Plus 20, to safeguard multi-stakeholder governance and internet infrastructure around the world. The internet's an amazing invention, arguably humanity's greatest. But when Canadians log onto the internet today, many find that it is not serving them the way that it should. There are downsides to the constant connectivity that has become our everyday life, and it affects literally every aspect of human society. Personally, I'm sure we all see it in our social media feeds, the vitriol, the outrage, the never-ending stream of information that requires us as individuals to sort fact from fiction on the fly. Socially, this materializes in many different ways, like mental health issues for kids, journalism in crisis, proliferation of fractured and polarizing political discourse. Economically, the economies of hyperscaling, unlocked by the internet, have been utilized by big companies to build what have become effective oligopolies. And as a result, we get left with increased inequality, economic inequality. Politically, this economic insecurity, polarizing discourse, information disorder have left us as societies more divided than ever, vulnerable to foreign adversaries who want to take advantage of this fraught landscape. And geopolitically, we're seeing the end of an era of peace that all of us in this room have enjoyed for the bulk of, if not our entire lives. The world is becoming a multipolar and, unfortunately, conflict-stricken environment. And Canada, as a principled country that sticks up for human rights, is facing challenges, and for example, suffering cyber attacks by countries like Russia and North Korea, who don't share our liberal democratic values, small L liberal. Across the globe, there's broad agreement that things need to change. We're leaving the Wild West era of the internet behind us. Governments, including our own, are churning out digital policies and regulations at literally a breakneck speed, especially for governments. Often they are about managing the negative externalities that I've just described, and reasonably so. Many of these policies can be very positive. For example, Bill C-26 is what I think a welcome initiative that should strengthen cybersecurity across critical infrastructure that Canadians rely on most. We need wise and pragmatic legislation to mitigate and manage the harms that occur at the application layer, the layer that we as humans interact with. To achieve this, legislation should be designed with the consultation of the multi-stakeholder internet community to help keep the internet open, secure, and interoperable, and ensure any new rules about the technology itself do not adversely impact the internet. But while laws and regulations meant to address the harmful content we've seen proliferate over the past few years, those regulations have received, of course, the lion's share of our attention. There are other pressing internet governance issues that deserve our consideration. This brings me back to critical internet resources, the IP addresses, the domain name system, the root server system, the actual infrastructure that makes the internet work, and the governance of the internet, the networks that connect us. Back in the early 2000s, when most of us, some of you here will remember that, but not everybody, I get it, when we all connected by DSL, often in a dedicated server room or computer room of some sort, you know, in the land before time of iPhones and Facebook, governments across the globe participated in a United Nations World Summit on Information Society. WSIS. And it's there that they agreed to formalize multi-stakeholder internet governance in something called the Tunis Agenda, the document that set out how governments would work together in this new era, the information society. And that's when they really formalized that multi-stakeholderism is the driving force of internet governance. But next summer, governments are going back to the drawing board at the World Summit on the Information Society Plus 20 review. And they kind of have their fingers on a slider between multilateralism and multi-stakeholderism, and how internet governance is going to be done in the future based on that continuum. The outputs of this review have the potential to alter global internet governance by making multilateralism the dominant or more dominant structure of internet governance. Multilateralism by definition, or increased multilateralism by definition, would increase governmental decision-making over critical internet resources and potentially decrease the influence of the communities whose job it is to actually operate the internet every day and make it work. The reality is that in a multilateral environment where it's one country, one vote, right now countries that don't share similar perspectives or values about how the internet should be run outnumber those who do, the like-minded. Moreover, many of these non-like-minded countries, the countries that don't prioritize democratic values or economic freedoms, they are actually well organized and dedicating significant resources to try to get more influence over these critical internet resources. A key UN process, not the WSIS, but a key UN process that unfolded earlier this year foreshadows what we're actually up against in the WSIS Plus 20 review. At the United Nations General Assembly this past September, UN member states adopted something called the Pact for the Future. It's an intergovernmental agreement about global governance moving forwards, in which they included one of the most significant intergovernmental agreements on digital issues in the past 2 decades, something called the Global Digital Compact, or the GDC. The GDC process gave us a preview of what we're in for: an opaque process with ad hoc multi-stakeholder inputs based on multi-stakeholders demanding it, and adversarial member states who prolong debates, use all kinds of procedural tactics to wear down supporters of multi-stakeholder internet governance. And you can see here what some of the non-like-minded countries put forward to try to shape internet governance in their favor. Both interventions aim, as you can see on the screen behind me, aim to increase governmental decision-making over critical internet resources, IP addresses, domain name system, root servers. And increased government influence inevitably comes at the expense of other stakeholders, the people whose day-to-day job it is to operate the internet, and the people who use it and need it in their day-to-day life, business, organizations, education. As I mentioned, opposing member states are well-resourced, very coordinated, and definitely prepared for this fight. In order to tip the scales in their favor so they can influence or have greater influence over the allocation of these critical internet resources. Even if it doesn't receive the same attention as domestic internet policy debates, I'd argue that the WSIS Plus 20 review is just as, if not potentially more important. Because without a multi-stakeholder global internet, our efforts to improve the online lives of Canadians could be in vain, and the internet of the future will be significantly more fraught than it is even today. At CIRA, from our position as a technical operator, we're engaging in these dialogues to defend, strengthen, and evolve multi-stakeholderism. I certainly wouldn't say that multi-stakeholderism is perfect. Far from it. It does need to be evolved and strengthened. But it is also a system of internet governance that has put near 6 billion people online. You know, as I said, at CIRA, we're definitely engaged in these dialogues to defend and improve multi-stakeholderism. And for example, we're currently developing a study of technical operators, folks like us and in other parts of the ecosystem, from across the globe to understand how multi-stakeholder internet governance can evolve and get better to serve our needs, to ultimately become stronger and more resilient, both technically and probably politically. And this will help guide some of our advocacy as the WSIS process unfolds over roughly the next year. As well, CIRA co-founded and continues to support the Technical Community Coalition for Multi-Stakeholderism, or the TCCM, a coalition of over 24 and growing, mission-aligned technical operators from around the world who are committed to shaping global internet governance in defense and improvement of multi-stakeholderism. And together, coalition members have participated in a wide range of UN and related internet governance dialogues. And the good news is it's getting traction. Because of our strength in numbers, the breadth and depth of that community, our inputs are getting listened to. But we can't do it by ourselves. So my call to you today, everybody in this room, everybody online, is to engage now. To engage now. Canada has a deep bench of expertise in multi-stakeholder internet governance and has long punched above its weight. We need to mobilize and leverage this experience and expertise. And I want to give kudos to our Government of Canada colleagues in the room, for it is they who have vocally defended multi-stakeholder internet governance in the UN processes at the GDC earlier this year. For non-government actors, we need to support their efforts with our expertise and insight as they step up to bat at WSIS Plus 20, because it will be governments in the room. And for the government officials in this room, I'd urge you to resource accordingly, to participate in these international dialogues and work together with non-governmental stakeholders, many of whom are right here in this room, to help you, to back you up in the ways that you need in those environments. Because these are also the people who can show up, provide support, and offer a perspective on Canada's best interests or Canadians' best interests. If Canadian stakeholders, the people in this room especially, don't get involved, the technical community, civil society, academia, and other stakeholders will likely find themselves on the outside looking in, with diminished influence over the governance of the internet. I firmly believe that we can come out of this inflection point in internet governance with a better, more trusted internet that supports everyone. I know the first part of what I said can seem a little bit demoralizing, but I wouldn't be up here if I didn't truly believe that we have the opportunity to improve and strengthen multi-stakeholderism, the form of internet governance that has put 6 billion people online in 20 years. But to get there, the status quo needs to change. At home, here in Canada, it has to look like wise and pragmatic legislation and regulation to address the real harms on the internet. And second, it's up to all of us to get informed and engage in the international processes, particularly the WSIS Plus 20 process at this point, to defend multi-stakeholderism and our form of internet governance, as well as improve it. Multi-stakeholder internet governance is worth defending. It also needs to be strengthened and evolved. It's what has made the internet the critical resource that underpins the Canadian economy and all aspects of society. And it's what will give us the power to shape the future of the internet that works for all of us. We have an awesome day today. I looked at all the panels, the people on the panels. Every single one looks amazing in the context of helping us build a better internet in Canada. So enjoy the day, stick around, try the slide, and please, if there's one thing to remember, please engage. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, Byron, for your opening keynote, for offering your vision, for giving us a briefing on what's happening globally, and most importantly, how we can really all engage in this multi-stakeholderism approach. So now it's time for our first panel. So I'd like to introduce Upholding the Principles of the Internet in the 2020s. And we have some incredible panelists who I'd like to invite up to the stage. So first, Alexandra Posadzki, Arbour, Mark Surman, Michele Austin, and Adiel Akplogan. Please join us on stage. Thank you.
All right, thank you all for joining us. So, to kick things off, Canada and its international peers signed the Declaration for the Future of the Internet, reaffirming the commitment to key Internet principles: open, free, global, interoperable, reliable, and secure. These principles face no shortage of obstacles. Diving into the lower layers of the Internet, this panel will explore these challenges and solutions to uphold these principles and the distinct role each stakeholder group plays in doing so. So please welcome me in joining our panelists. You can find all of their bios online, so I won't read them out. But joining us today, we have Mark Surman, President of Mozilla, Adiel Akplogan, VP Technical Engagement at ICANN.org, Michele Austin, VP of Public Affairs at Bell Canada, and Arbour, Director General of International Telecommunications and Internet Policy at ICED, Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada. Thank you all for joining me. So just to kick things off, I'm going to ask a question to each of you, and we can kind of go in this order that you're seated, and then we'll go into kind of more specific questions based on your areas of expertise. So for the first question, from your stakeholder group's perspective, what are the key challenges to keeping the internet open, free, global, interoperable, reliable, and secure? Adiel, starting with you.
Yep, thank you. I'm from the technical community, so for me, I will say that standards that are interoperable, open, are critical to maintain this. But the challenge we are facing, and you have heard Byron talk about that, is the contortion that is happening between the technical underlying element of the internet and the policy, the public policy side. How do we make the two work together? How do we translate some of the technical stuff into policy that makes the internet?
Michele.
I would say from the private sector, because that's where I come from, the two things that I think about often are scalability and choice. And so choice is fairly easy. I mean, how many of us last night flipped open our phone and doom scrolled before we went to bed, and didn't doom scroll one platform or at one spot. We went all over the place and did it. So I think choice is really, really important. And from a public policy perspective, the banning of TikTok, the company, in Canada is a really interesting part of that discussion. And then scalability is extremely important to the private sector, because you want great Canadian companies like the one that used to occupy this space to be able to compete internationally, and to be able to build a great product or service on the internet and scale internationally. You don't want to have to build a different product for Canada, the United States, Sweden, and Brazil. You want to have, when it's governed, some ability to scale in one way. So those would be the two things that I think about.
Andre, over to you.
Thanks. A challenge that I grapple with regularly is the dramatic increase in skepticism of even the value of the internet. And there's a number of reasons for that. It can be a negativity bias. It can be kind of what am I dealing with in front of me? But there are, of course, huge problems that we are encountering that are the product or vectors of by the internet. I think we lose track of the miraculous value of it sometimes, and we need to keep that front and center, but also be clear-eyed about the problems that we do need to solve. And I entered government as a bureaucrat because it's fundamentally about problem solving. Like, that's really what it is about. People are elected because people want them to solve problems for them, and if you don't solve problems for them, they're going to go with the other guys. So how do we approach these problems in a clear-eyed way with solutions in mind, but also preserving and cultivating what made the internet so phenomenal to begin with?
Mark?
I like that phrase about the miraculousness of the internet and then the realities of it. So, I represent, I guess, both civil society and business in a funny way, in that Mozilla is a $500 million a year social enterprise, which makes us a very big nonprofit and a very tiny tech company. And coming from that perspective, I think all of the kind of perils we face on the internet really, define this debate and are important. And everybody's talked about them. Byron talked about them earlier. Also, I think we have to look at this moment where people are questioning the value of the internet. But what do we want? So what do we want as Canadians in our tech policy and from our tech companies? And what do we want out of a process like WSIS, which I agree, having been there in both Tunis and Geneva at the beginning, could be a watershed moment or an inflection point, but in a worse direction or better direction. So in thinking about those things, I would really push us, and I think where Mozilla is, to raise our sights on two things. Pluralism and public goods. The second one sounds very boring. The first one sounds very abstract. But if you think about public goods, the things that we'll talk about a lot today, the protocols, the DNS, all the stuff underneath, are this, and just the miraculousness of the internet, is this weird public-private kind of citizen-built, non-rivalrous public good that lets you ship something around the world and scale it. Like, there's very few things like that we have in the world, and it's a human invention. And so I think thinking about those kinds of public goods, like, we created a tremendous public good, and it is something that has created trillions and trillions of dollars in value. Open source alone has created, I think, $8 trillion in a recent Harvard study over the last few years. So looking at how, as we move forward, moving up the stack into everything, including AI, how we continue to make sure we have those public goods, because they're critical for democracy, they're critical for commerce, they're really critical for the internet being something that we want. And I don't think we think about that enough in Canada. I think we often kind of try to protect ourselves, but we can really be helping to define that global public goods agenda for the future of the internet. And I think without it, we go back to, I don't know, something between 1984 and cable TV in 1984. And so I think there's a real need to focus on that kind of public goods piece. And then pluralism, we really started with this idea that a free internet would kind of create great stuff. And the good news is it did, right? A lot of incredible, wonderful, democratic, cultural, weird, funny things have happened because of the internet. And it also created a lot of horrible stuff, including, really undermining our democracies. And thinking about how do we, by design, think about internet regulation, how do internet companies think about pluralism, as opposed to just hoping for it, because we have things open, like that is a critical part of what we do as any of these stakeholders.
Thank you for that. And just a quick note for our audience, we are going to be taking some audience questions near the end of the panel. So if you have questions, you can start thinking about what you might want to ask. So I have a question here from Michele, and it is about some of the key disruptive factors that network operation can face. So what kind of factors does Bell face, and how do you navigate through them? And I've written about some of these things in the past in my previous role as a telecom reporter.
Yeah, about wildfires, is that correct? Yeah, it's kind of helpful to have the ability to turn on the internet to get to work. And so reliability and resiliency is extremely important to us as internet service providers, and we're certainly experiencing a monumental change in climate. So be that hurricanes, Hurricane Fiona on the East Coast was certainly a huge challenge for all internet service delivery organizations, and wildfires on the West. So one of the things we're really, I wouldn't say struggling with, but adapting to is the ability to make sure that you have access to the internet. And that comes, the challenges are very, very broad now. So there definitely is the climate challenge, right? So when there's a climate event or a weather event, the first ones in are the tree clears, right? So nobody can go in until you can actually get access to where you need to go. And then the second thing is the internet doesn't work without electricity. So we need to either have hydro people go in, or we need to have a backup power source. And what really hurt us in Fiona was we did actually have a number of backup power sources, but the bridge to get to the tower went down in the rain and the flood. And so once our generator ran out of fuel, we couldn't get there to restart all the systems and make sure that the towers work. So then we can go in and we have things, generators, and we have a number of ways that we make sure the internet keeps running. And I'll go on the new sort of challenges that we have are actually copper theft, because there's a lot of legacy copper in our system, and I don't think it's any secret that affordability is a real challenge for a lot of people. And if you're in northern New Brunswick, where you have aerial wires, and you can see there's a lot of copper there, and if you take a little bit of that down and go to the scrapyard, you'll get about $700, and that might feed your family for a month. So there's actually been a lot of copper theft happening on a regular basis, which is a real challenge. There's a number of solutions to that. One of them is fiber. Actually, fiber is the most resilient of our delivery mechanisms. It withstands heat and water much better than copper does. I could talk about copper forever, so you're gonna have to stop me. But when you have copper, you actually, oftentimes it's underground. So as you walk around here, you look at the manholes, you'll see various logos on those holes. But when you open it up, it's usually full of water. And so we have to keep those copper wires, because there's also an electricity charge through it, dry. And so it's a much more difficult to maintain copper than it is fiber. So there's a lot of emerging, but not emerging challenges to us. So as copper, becomes more valuable, we'll definitely keep an eye on that. The climate certainly is a challenge, but that's everybody's challenge, and we're very, very cognizant of that, and do definitely have a multi-stakeholder approach in trying to make sure that you have access to your internet.
I've heard some crazy stories too about some of the efforts that telecoms have undergone to try to respond to wildfires. So, bringing generators in on helicopters and all that kind of stuff. And
governments are actually really helpful for that, which is really, really important as well. But the other thing that you have to remember is that when you're in the middle of a wildfire in a remote area of the country, the first thing you're thinking about as a technician isn't always your job, it's your family, right? And you're probably a long way away from them as well. So there's really a lot of things that you have to balance as these climate issues emerge.
For sure. So I've got a question for Andre. I'd love to get your thoughts on what are the geopolitical forces that shape the policy space, and how should stakeholders approach them?
Thanks. Good question. We see this playing out in a few different dimensions, but I'll highlight two in particular. So the first, in the international space is more what you see visibly, and it is how there are different competing visions of the internet playing out in different global arenas. The Canadian, vision of the internet, more multi-stakeholder, open, innovative, that type of thing. But of course, China has a very different vision of the internet. Russia as well, a number of other countries aligned in that perspective. And then there's a lot of countries that are kind of in the middle. They don't necessarily see the benefits of the internet the way Canada does because of their different local context. They may see historical governance processes as dominated by a bunch of rich countries that don't reflect their interests. And also they see the genuine problems that China is saying we have a solution for in terms of dealing with cybersecurity or issues like that. And so it's incumbent on us to help promote both the positive aspects of the internet, but also come forward with solutions that are responsive to the very legitimate concerns that folks have. Part of that is approaching things in good faith, but also approaching things clear-eyed, because the opposing view, they are well-resourced and they are flooding the zone in terms of trying to inflect multiple different fora, sometimes in very technical-sounding ways, with a negative connotation, and they have a very long view. Like, they're not just thinking about what to do over the next 1 or 2 years, they're thinking about how do I want to see things in 2050, and building towards that. The second mechanism that I wanted to touch on is the more dramatic, but sometimes kind of undercurrent, and it is just how cyber attacks are a common function of statecraft, and linked to more kind of physical aspects. There was certainly a spike in cyber attacks coming out of the Ukraine conflict. China is very clear in attacking aspects of critical infrastructure in the United States and American allies. There are a staggering volume of cyber attacks on Government of Canada infrastructure as well as critical infrastructure. And that's happening as a matter of course. It is happening in conjunction with other geopolitical goals, sometimes military goals, and sometimes to sow chaos. So to discredit, the Canadian way of life or model, causing disruption, causing chaos in those zones. So Byron mentioned C26 as one of the tools to try and combat that. And a way to take more proactive approaches to defending against those types of cyber threats.
Mm-hmm. Since you mentioned Bill C26, can you just kind of give us an update on where that process is at?
Yes.
So I'm going off script a little here.
Sure. It is currently with the Senate committee, SECD, that is studying it. And clause by clause was to occur this past Monday, and it's been postponed. The committee organizes its own business. We're expecting it to pick up quite in the near future. I've been told to keep this Monday afternoon clear in my schedule to be prepared to show up to the Senate on that front. So that's kind of where it is in the legislative process. I think, though, that should it receive royal assent, that's just one small step. And it's going to be the rules that come out of that legislation that actually, bring it into force, that actually contribute positively. Certainly for my department's role in that, for anyone that's participated in one of our spectrum regulatory processes or what have you, you kind of know what to expect, but we do really rely on active participation. There's a consultation paper or a kind of draft policy that gets posted online, and we rely on the comments that will come. So one of the first regulatory processes that we're planning is draft rules for restricting high-risk vendor equipment, which is a topic that a lot of people are interested in, and we look forward to hearing more views on that.
Okay. And what would you say are some of the key government priorities in the internet policy space, and how can stakeholders who share these priorities engage with you guys?
Great. So I already I spoke about C26.
I don't know that you sold that really well, Andre.
So we talked about C26, but there'll be more to come. So that's contingent a bit on the parliamentary process that I don't have control over for good reason. But there'll be more to come on the website in terms of any draft rules and input there. Kind of switching gears to the international space. So we're, of course, very active participants in the different processes at the ITU, with ICANN, and then we have a special line of work in prep for WSIS. So for the ITU and ICANN, we have what we call Canadian Preparatory Committee planning sessions, which are multi-stakeholder sessions between the different government interests and technical community and private sector players. So for each ICANN meeting or in preparation for ITU, we learn and collaborate and think about how we want to approach those. If anyone's interested, please feel free to reach out to me or David or Allison or someone on my team. And we are just going to be kicking off a dedicated stream of a multi-stakeholder working group in prep for the WSIS and how we can gear up for that. So looking forward to taking that forward.
Thank you. Question here for Mark. So how can civil society best uphold the founding principles of the internet? Do they have the means and opportunities to direct them?
Well, I'll cheat because we're in this weird spot of being a small company and a big nonprofit and kind of cover both of them a little bit. And I think partly why they matter is if you kind of think about the two sides that you were talking about, really one is, authoritarian governments trying to take the internet in a particular direction. But the other is a set of companies that are bigger than any companies that have ever existed, like bigger than the Dutch East India Company, bigger than the British East India Company. And so you kind of have these private sector colonial players, or big companies, and authoritarian governments really defining the agenda. And I think there's an opportunity, both in many dimensions. It is some of the reasons I think about pluralism and public goods, for civil society, small companies, but also small countries, even though we're physically big, who may kind of have a different view than either of those. And I think that's the opportunity for the people in the room, for organizations like Mozilla, for civil society, even for companies that here might be large, like Shopify, but actually in the global scheme of things are pipsqueaks compared to the really dominant players in the marketplace. And I think gathering those kind of sets of folks who have an interest in the internet being more pluralistic and there being public goods we can all build in on, including that cybersecurity, I think, is something that we underthink about as a public good. Right? There are very few issues or kind of threats to our society. If you think about wildfires or hurricanes or many other things, national defense, where we wouldn't think about making sure that we have a public strategy. And we really leave it often to the private sector and regulators as opposed to saying, how do we band forces to deal with things like cybersecurity threats? So I think part of it is taking those players, whether they're civil society organizations, independent kind of challenger companies, or countries that are instead of neither in the US kind of dominant economic player space of Silicon Valley and Seattle, or in the Chinese and allies Russia space of authoritarian governments. And I think if we can't carve out that middle way, this is really going to go poorly because neither of those players have our interests in mind. And if you think about the economic growth of this country, like just think selfishly about Canada for a second, if we can't have 10 or 50 or 100 more Shopifys, or if Shopify or Cohere or whoever our companies are that grow become RIM or become Nortel, we are not participants in the global economy. And so this third way, as well as our industrial policy and domestic policy, are critical to our economic participation in the world and economic health here.
How would you say, this warning buzzword, how would you say that AI intersects with these internet policies?
Well, it's critical in lots of ways. AI is basically what TCP/IP was or what HTML was at different eras, right? AI is just another acronym for the building blocks or the fabric of how we make digital things. And the difference of this era is, there's a number of them. One is digital things like organize our lives and our economy. And so what happens with AI is just as important, I would say more important because it's open-ended than what happened with TCP/IP and HTML. And that's where we really focus on this idea of public AI and public goods in AI, making sure that there's some way to kind of have a public lane, much as we've had a public lane in, say, broadcasting and a commercial lane in broadcasting. Or in transportation, we have private transportation and public transportation. So a critical thing for us is to situate ourselves in thinking AI is an organizing piece of fabric by which we determine what's going to happen to our economy and our society in terms of the digital world. And we need to kind of have a strategy for how it not only serves private interests or authoritarian interests, but also democratic public interests.
I wonder if any other panelists would like to jump in on the AI question.
Yeah, I think it's a buzzword. Let's put it that way, and it's a use of the internet. The AI is at the top, and it's new. Everybody is a little bit freaked out about where it can go, but it poses the question of its governance. And I think what would be interesting is to see how the multi-stakeholder model that we've used to keep the internet growing and make it permissionless, innovative, how can we apply that to the AI? Bringing in the right guardrail, but allowing it to flourish on top of the internet, which is the infrastructure that is critical. Because without that infrastructure, we can't build anything on top of it. Keeping the infrastructure stable, but bringing in the multi-stakeholder model of governance at the AI content usage level to make sure that the use is still safe.
One thing that I think about from a policymaking standpoint from AI is a lot of parallels to when people were thinking about digital policy. And so there are some features of AI that suggest an AI policy, like either thinking about the scale of compute and what goes behind those resources, or how different models are trained and used, or some of the privacy dimensions of it. But many aspects of AI don't require an AI policy. They require like nimbleness in a whole bunch of other policy domains in terms of just the same way that when you think about digital policy, there's aspects of copyright policy that are digital or what have you, and trying to solve all of your AI issues in capital AI policy is probably too cumbersome, and you need to think about, and you will bake yourself into a corner, to mix two metaphors, when you really want to think about like technologically neutral policy making that takes into consideration the aspects of AI that you need to confront, but that are more flexible and broader than just AI. So just a very narrow example is robocalling. You get a call from a nefarious actor, robocall, and it's AI generated content of, let's say it's a politician, and that type of thing. That can be approached within an AI context, but also that type of call is already prohibited and tackled. So do you need an AI intervention specifically? Sometimes you just do both, just to make it very, very clear, and that's fine. But sometimes you don't need it necessarily AI hammer.
Right. Yeah.
Can I pick a fight?
I love a good
Because
quarrel.
the panel will get boring.
Yeah.
First of all, I want to agree. And it came a little bit in what you're talking about as well, that at the use case level, AI-specific policy isn't needed. I think we need tech policy, or even just human rights policy, or so on. But I think it's also, like, to me, really important to recognize that we have had one of the best AI policies in the world and are bungling it, in my opinion. And so we do need specific AI policy on R&D, and Canada has done an amazing job of building 3 centers of excellence, making us a global player in AI. Like, that is AI-specific policy. We've done it so well. And like, that's, we have 2 of the 3 godfathers of AI who are, tied to Canadian AI centers of excellence. But we're not producing any public goods out of it. There's no expectation that other than the centers themselves, that there's open source or that there's give back to the rest of the society. It's easily something the government could tie to funding, is that there are open source assets. Many of the national labs coming out of, you think of Switzerland with its 10,000 GPUs, big contributor into open source by design. And so I think that is AI specific policy that we need to get right, is tying R&D investment to creating public goods. I'm happy to help the government on that. And then the other is the economic policy we have, and the Europeans screwed this up worse than us, but we don't have industrial policy to leverage the incredible leadership in AI that we've had. I mean, Cohere is a great example of where that's working out, but we need a lot more companies focused at global markets, leveraging Canada's investment in AI in order to, there's billions or trillions of dollars of opportunity on the table. And I think for the government to look at how do we actually help Canadians and Canadian companies tap into those markets based on the R&D investments we've made in the last decade and a half, there's so much opportunity in there. So I think those are 2 AI-specific policy priorities that this government could, or the next one, could take on.
Do you want to rebuttal to that?
I'll just say point well taken.
Yeah.
I think the challenge of how do we take some of the Canadian successes and how do they scale internationally is not a new challenge in Canadian economic or industrial policy. It is one that is like interwoven into so many aspects of economic policy in Canada. And I think from a government standpoint, there's the challenge of like, people want us to be active, but at the same time, like, there are real costs to government wading in. Like, there are certain things that we don't do well, or that we do in a too heavy-handed a way, or like, you should support more of X. But then when we support X, they're like, you're biasing the market towards some government thing instead of letting price signals, help support that, right? So how do you strike that right balance of that's not just kind of ex post, kind of, just looking at historically. So I think that certainly the investments in Canadian compute that were announced in the most recent budget are part of that kind of tackling, enabling infrastructure and having in Canada compute facilities that can be used for a variety of uses, whether they be scientific or otherwise, are one aspect where the government sees that it can support. I think the different the global cluster initiative that the government has been working on, not just in AI, but AI is one piece of it, of where it's trying to bring the convening value of the government into place, where you have the mix of government, academia, civil society, kind of private sector, and some of the agglomeration economies of just proximity and having people kind of bumping into each other and engaging is another way that the government has looked to try and support this type of thing. But it's certainly not a solved issue, and appreciate people's ideas.
Mm-hmm. I certainly don't envy the challenge that regulators face in trying to strike that very delicate balance. As a recovering telecom reporter who frequently wrote about CRTC policy, and it's like, you push this way, it's too far on this side, and if you go that way, it's too far on that side. So it really is a delicate balancing act. I have a question for Adiel. As more internet-related legislation is introduced across the globe, are these principles properly safeguarded from, or are they sensitive to, changes in political agendas in different jurisdictions?
Safeguard, I would say, definitely not, because the technology is evolving, and I would say that we are reaching a point where the geopolitics in general is catching up with us. You know, we have an ideal around the internet technology, something universal, something that can transfer on the world, etc. 30 years ago, that's what we were all chanting. But the geopolitics is catching up, so there is no safeguard. We have to continuously defend what makes the internet what it is today, which is a permissionless way of innovating, of finding solutions to things. That is there. But how do we ensure that the geopolitics doesn't come in a disruptive way in that? And that is the challenge of regulation in here, because regulators are usually, they want to make sure that their constituent, which is the people in the country, are protected, make sure that there is a way for them to be shielded against cyber war or all harm, all kind of harm. But doing that, they shouldn't try at the same time to get in the way of allowing, AI, being AI, allowing the internet, the TCP/IP, the protocol itself to be used to innovate. So we have to continuously help the government and the regulators to translate what we as technical community in general know, how we know to fix the thing, into public policy, how the two should work together. So the principles are there. Yeah, we still believe in them, but more and more we are going to see pressure from government to get in, because they are elected. They are accountable to their citizens, and that need will continue to come. It is our role as technical people, specifically, I'm talking from the technical point of view, to adjust our language, to make government and regulator partner instead of confrontational relationship, because that is the only way where the multi-stakeholder model can work and ensure that the different stakeholders find their way out of the system. Mm-hmm. Right. So we have to continue hammering the fact that the technology has to be disconnected from the geopolitical reality to maintain an interoperable network globally. That is a fact. We have also to work at the international scene with intergovernmental organizations that are used to intergovernmental system. Multi-stakeholder doesn't ring a bell for everyone to the same way, but working with them, participating, engaging with them to understand that there is a room for government in the multi-stakeholder model, not in a confrontational way, but working together. I use an example, for instance, for government participation in general. ICANN, other organizations have policy related to the internet identifier, for instance. In several countries, government try to see, especially small government or China or other country, they want to have control over that. They want to be able to be accountable for anything that is happening around those identifiers. And sometimes government, want the stakeholder to behave in a certain way. A specific example is in a country where the government wants all the ISPs to register all the IP they are using at their level, right? They want to take a new law completely to do that. And in my previous role, I was approached to say, yeah, they are going to do this. This is going to be bad. That nobody is going to like that. So what we did was to approach the government and say, hey, do you know that there is a policy that was developed by your ISP? They agree to register how they are using the IP address in who is the public, who is that. Do you know that? No. Okay. It is a policy that's already exists, was approved by consensus, so they agree to apply that policy. So can you at least engage them, let them know that you know that that policy is there so that they actually implement them, right? It's a voluntary policy, but if the government doesn't know that that policy exists and it is a bottom-up policy in which all the ISP has contributed to make it, you know, a policy for them, government cannot encourage them to implement it at the local level. We're not talking at the broad, but at the local level. So there is no way, it's not always necessary to reinvent the wheel, but allowing government to be aware of what is happening at the global level, at the policy level, at the, those organizational level, help government take policy or initiate policy that anchor on those global policy to make the local environment safer. So it has to be a collaborative effort where we from the technical community, we see government as partner, but government as well see the technical community as partner that can help make those local policy better.
Mm-hmm. And Mark had kind of alluded to this, but what are your thoughts on the role that these large tech players play in this whole space?
Well, positively, they are helping us to see the magnificence of the internet, or the use of the internet, right? We all use them. But again, that is a reality that is catching up with us because those big companies are driven by economical factor, right? There is a need. They are trying to address that need. So we are being catching up by those factors, but at the same time, we need to continue to bring them into the discussion. One of the risks that we have is that the multi-stakeholder process being balkanized by those big tech. When that happens, for instance, you know, the diversity of opinion can be completely overwhelmed by those big tech. That is one possibility. The second risk is the interoperability. If you have two big companies providing all the service, the need of interoperability is not the same anymore, right? So by nurturing those big tech, we may end up, you know, shooting ourselves in the foot by destroying the real underlying element of the internet. So we need to continue to let innovation to happen at the speed, at the edge, as much as possible, so that the diversity is stay there, the competition continue to come, and make sure that those big tech continue to adhere to those principles as well. The same way we work with government, we should continue working with those big tech companies to make sure that they understand that.
So we have some time for audience questions now. There is someone with a mic.
Lots of questions.
I believe there's supposed to be someone with a mic. George is on it.
We can hear you if you shout. Ah, true.
Does it work? Test.
I can repeat your question, or we can.
Well, it's going to be long.
Maybe not.
It's not really going to be long. No. First, before I get to the question, I want to weigh in on the discussion about AI, and I think the answer is somewhere between what all of you said. I was at a conference last week, and there was a discussion. It's called the Canadian Science Policy Conference, and there was a discussion about what sectors Canada should be dominant in, and the two that came up were quantum and AI, to which I reacted and said, those are not sectors. Sectors are mining, agriculture, automotive. And the question then is like the government's making a huge investment in infrastructure for AI. The question is to the application of what to turn it into a socioeconomic benefit. That's my editorial comment. My question actually starts with the opening comments from Byron, hopefully he's still here, where he asserted, and I agreed, that the internet is an amazing invention of humanity. And he said it might be the biggest one, but I would argue that you could probably make a good case for the printing press. Because the printing press allowed humans to retain intergenerational knowledge. Before
As a
that,
journalist, I agree.
you agree with that?
As a journalist, I'm a little biased, but yeah.
Yeah, I bring that up because, well, first I'll tell you, before the printing press, we had to remember things through mnemonic, right? 30 days, September, April, June, and November. Where you can now just read it, and if you're reading something, you're actually reading something that was written by somebody who could be long dead, and yet their knowledge is still available to you. And if you take that parallel example to the internet, yes, we have to protect the internet. We probably have to protect access to the printing press, but it's actually the content that's coming out of it that is actually where the danger is. And I would assert, like Adiel, you made a good point about large organizations, large companies, and you said they're focused on economic things. I would suggest they're focused on profit. And profit unfettered leads to societal damage. Just internalize that, right? If you let private corporations do whatever they want, they'll pollute the environment because it's cheaper just to dump stuff into the lake than it is to make sure you have good practice. They'll have child employment. So there needs to be a balance. The government has to look at what's the content that's being produced by some of these large forces that have more money than any of us, more money than God maybe, if that's a thing that's possible, that have different agendas than countries. And so I would throw to the panel, like, what is the holistic approach that protects the internet as physical infrastructure, all the way down to the content that's fomenting distrust in society and creating civil unrest?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I can start happily. Gosh, if you open up your stock app and take a look at BCE's stock for the last year, I would say, boy, it would be great to make profits. I think a number of companies in this country would be very happy to improve their profits over which have suffered quite severely since the pandemic. So I think you're assuming that profit is ultimately going to lead to evil, which is kind of a offensive assumption to me, first of all. And second of all, the content one is really interesting as well. There's a reason they're called platform. Arguably, platforms, Google doesn't create content. It's the users who create it, right? Google provides the platform. X provides the platform. Meta provides the platform, right? And also built in that assumption is that you won't have a choice. You have to use these platforms, right? Maybe we're at a position where Google is, yes, it's a necessity as a business. You have to use Google. But have you looked at DuckDuckGo? Have you looked at Microsoft? There is a lot of choice baked into the system. So I think we are assuming the worst. We're assuming the worst about profit. We're assuming the worst about motive. We're assuming the worst about delivery method. And then this is a problem. Well, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? Is the problem that we're trying to solve content? All right. If we're trying to protect people with online harms, let's take anti-Semitism. Let's just jump right in there and say, all right, if you're trying to protect people from anti-Semitism, why is it that the platform has to have it down, convicted, the offender taken off the platform within 24 hours, where in the synagogue, the standard doesn't exist? The police doesn't have to have the perpetrator found, tried, the anti-Semitic images off the synagogue within 24 hours. So maybe the problem isn't the content. Maybe the problem that we're actually solving is the speed and the scope, right? Because that's what the internet has delivered, speed and scope that isn't happening in the real world. So I think that we're taking these, we have to solve a problem, we have to solve a problem. Great, what is that problem that we're trying to solve? Why is it that we can't let it play out in a multi-stakeholder, public-private way? Why does the government have to get involved instantly? So I'm going to challenge, throwing that challenge back at you to say that I think that the internet is a wild, wonderful, fantastic place, and each of us has a great deal of responsibility in how we use it that I think we are negating and withdrawing from. You got me really worked up. Thanks for that.
Yeah, thank you. I agree, and I don't think we are going to make a trial of the profit here and say profit is bad. The history has shown us that society has always worked using profit, using an economic reality. The thing is, and I think somebody said it before, is that the problem is not the technology and their usage per se, but the society. How do we project our day-to-day life in how technology are used? I think that's probably the way to look at it, because at the end of the day, the ramification of the way we use those technology come into our day-to-day life. Come to stuff that we do in real life happen, online, happen in different environments, maybe faster or in a scope that is more wider. So maybe that is what to look at, the application of those things to our social life. How do we translate the quote-unquote regulation? I don't want to use the word regulation that much, but the public policy in the way that we safeguard how we as human, we don't have to remove the human from the equation. We tend to do that very often and look at the technology only. But I believe that we are still human, and we as human, as imperfect as we can be, we use those technology to harm, to do work, etc. So how do we look at how can we protect the human into the bad usage of this technology? So it's not about regulating the technology, but how we as humans come into the picture.
Yes, I lost the mic, but I would say your argument, maybe on this stress where I think the issue is, and I think the issue is where Adiel is, and I think, the analog to saying Google is a platform is to say we have to actually protect the printing press itself. No, it's actually the use of the printing press that is where the issues come from. And over time, there was a system to ensure that in newspapers, for example, there were checks to make sure the credibility in the source. The internet has broken all that, and society is entirely based on trust.
Mark?
Okay. So we're getting beyond a question, and maybe we want to throw it to other questions, but I'll just say quickly, to take your original premise, I actually didn't hate it. I didn't hate it. But to answer it, because you said what's the kind of up the middle or across the spectrum thing, and to me, it does go back to very pragmatic, aggressive pluralism, and I'll say a little bit about that, and American antitrust policy. And really, it's not that profit's a problem, and we make a profit. We also, I hope we keep making a profit. We struggle like you do. But part of the problem is we exist in a digital world and a global economy organized by authoritarians who concentrate power and 5 to 8 companies who concentrate power. The issue is the concentration of power. I want you guys to make money. I use your fiber optic, and I want it to be great. That's a good part of capitalism. But when you have unfettered, as you said, concentration of power by private or state actors, I think we all know, at least I believe, that's not good for humanity. That's the reason we fight for democracy. It's the reason we have antitrust laws. And unfortunately, there's a certain kinds of things we can do around the authoritarian governments. That's a tougher problem. With the concentration of power in the U.S. tech economy, at least the people across the border have tools for that. It's going to be interesting to see what happens in this new government. I think they may actually do some of the right stuff on antitrust, despite me disagreeing with many of the things they'll do on other files. But I think those things that's kind of how I think about it, is pluralism and antitrust, but pragmatically. And I will say, a book, if people haven't read it, Plurality by Audrey Tang and Glenn Wheel. Audrey Tang is the cyber ambassador for Taiwan, is like a weird, mind-blowing book. It's like for policymakers, it's for engineers. It talks about everything from the invention of TCP/IP to where we are now with AI, but really will shift your mind. Plurality, you can get it free online or order it on Amazon. Great book.
Let's take a couple more questions from the audience. I saw a couple hands up.
Hello, Monica Song. I'm citizen and TMT lawyer in private practice. So take this question in that context. So I want to just pick up on the geopolitical aspects of some of the comments that have been made. So I'm going to address my question to Mr. Akplogan. I have a very small question. Is the World Wide Web a misnomer? And so maybe just to drill down on that, can you tell me and this audience what geopolitical interests are not represented at ICANN, or how is their participation evidenced? Thanks.
That's a good question.
Good. So we'll take the participation aspect. I think most of the interest, I would say, ICANN is a ICANN multi-stakeholder model, and I would like to use that word, ICANN multi-stakeholder model, because there are many other multi-stakeholder model. Actually is wide open and allow representation of many diverse interests in the process, including government, of course. And sometime in those processes, which are still multi-stakeholder, geopolitics comes in, to play a little bit around. So I would say that I think most of the key interests, including civil society, including end user, are represented in ICANN ecosystem in general, and all of them have the opportunity to participate in every single policy-making process. The participation are from different angles. There are those who participate directly in the elaboration of the policy, and those who are giving the opportunity to comment and provide their input to the policy, to the process. So I'll say that in the management of the number of resources and naming resources that ICANN has the mandate to coordinate, interests are well represented. To go a little bit further, we talk more accurately these days about the multilingual domain name, for instance. For me, it is one aspect that may look benign for most of the people, but are critical for that representation and the universality of the internet itself. Because for those of you who are familiar with the internet, 20 years ago, you cannot phantom that you can write an email address with, non-ASCII character, right? Yeah. Today, you can not only use an email, you can have your website, you can send email with or any character, even writing from left to right, right to left, like Arabic. So that is a fundamental evolution of how we use the internet, right? The technology has evolved to allow that, and that's also helped representation at certain level. And that is something that ICANN is pushing and investing a lot into allowing those who were not familiar using ASCII to express themselves to be able to use internationalized domain name to produce content that can be protected, but also to participate to the global debate.
Okay, I think we've got time for one last question. The lady over here in the middle.
Thank you. Good morning. Marita Mull speaking, Telecommunities Canada, and a very highly engaged person in the ICANN multi-stakeholder system on the end user community side, especially in the WSIS plus 20 file. Hello, Mark Surman. It's been many years.
It has been many years, yeah, nice to see you.
I'm constantly reminded of the fact that in 1993, Mark Surman and myself, one other person in the room, maybe others, Leslie Regenshade, there you are, Leslie. We were at one of the early community meetings about the internet, and it was about the public good. And I'm so happy to hear you use the word public good, even public lane, which I hadn't heard for years. So I'm sitting here thinking, okay, for all those things we were talking about at the time, when we really didn't have any idea of where this was going, what did in the end up being the public goods that we might have imagined, or what do we think? Where did that go in the end? In my own mind, I'm thinking, well, we've got CIRA. It's a non-profit. It belongs to members. Belongs to Canadians. That's the public good, right? Mozilla, also a big non-profit. There's a lot of public advocacy work. That's a public good. But one of the biggest ones, to me, is the multi-stakeholder system and the fact that that exists. That's a huge global public good that is mostly not on the radar of anybody who's not really involved in this particular context. So, that's my feeling. I'm just wondering, with the panel here, what do you think? What public goods have we got? What else can we add to that list? Maybe there's lots, but big ones. Thank you.
I mean, I'll answer because I set it up and let you guys think. I mean, there's some obvious ones, and then I want to poke at that multi-stakeholderism one because I think there's something really interesting for the future and for Canada there. But I mean, thank you for recognizing Mozilla. I mean, that's what we try to continue to be. Wikipedia, Signal is run by a nonprofit. Linux, while you can argue is under corporate capture, is controlled by a nonprofit. I would rather have all the big companies controlling the underlying infrastructure than one big company controlling the underlying infrastructure. So I think we have a lot, whether we go from TCP/IP and the protocols up to a lot of the fabric. And I do think we really risk in the AI era not creating those public goods, even though they're based on often stealing from the public or stealing copyrighted material. And so I think we need to have a public good strategy in this layer of the stack and in this era. The thing about multi-stakeholderism, and it's a challenge to Canada as a participant in the multi-stakeholder processes and to multi-stakeholder institutions, and I guess to all of us, is it is a public good. I mean, having been along for the ride in a lot of this stuff and still a big participant, well, not as big a participant as one, but supporter, multi-stakeholderism is a means to an end. And so I worry that we're focusing on protecting and shoring up the multi-stakeholderism to protect a particular layer of the stack and of the public goods. And if it's going to work, it has to be a means to the end of really the whole of our digital society, even as it evolves beyond today, but certainly the whole stack today, being managed with that multi-stakeholder approach. And if all we do is protect the network layer, which I worry is what happens given the history of the web part of the stack, given the history of these institutions, we're actually scuppered because the game has moved on. And so looking at how we modernize, and it's one of the things I was talking to Josh earlier about thinking about the SDGs as an input to WSIS, like starting at actually the human end of the stack and saying, what does multi-stakeholderism need to produce for us? That's exciting, but we have to go and win at that. And actually, the big forces at play, neither of them want multi-stakeholderism to win. I mean, that's why I kind of keep coming back to that. And a lot of us have to line up for that to work.
We do have the red light, but very quick.
Yeah, I think you touched on something very, very critical because usually when we look at the multi-stakeholder model, we look at it globally. One of my belief and all hats off is how do we translate that multi-stakeholderism at the local level as well? How do we make sure that processes that are used locally in country follow that multi-stakeholder? How do we, I won't say institutionalized, but how do we translate the multi-stakeholderism into the way things work locally? Because that's where many people who are affected are. That's how they can participate. There's few of us that go to the global meeting, global event and talk. But that concept, that how can we bring it to the that will allow us to apply to the whole spectrum of the thing, not only at the physical layer or at the underlying resources layer, but also to solve all the problems. And I think that is where probably a reflection is, how do we make sure that, people who want to implement the multi-stakeholder, they have a model that they can use at the local level that will help, bring it to the global level.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but thank you all for participating, asking such thoughtful questions. Thank you to our wonderful panelists for the very insightful discussion, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
And thanks, Alex.
Thank you very much to the panel,
good.
to
Nice to
Alexandra, Adiel, Michele, and Mark, and Andre. We've actually reached our first coffee break, so I'm going to invite everybody to go upstairs, get some refreshments. We're going to meet back here at 10:50. Maybe you might even want to be in your seats by 10:48 so that we can really be respectful of time and keep going with the panel. Thanks so much.